She was the untouchable CEO of a billion-dollar empire. He was just the janitor who cleaned her office at midnight. But when she slipped him a desperate note that read, "Someone is following me. Please don't leave," everything changed. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of corporate power. This is the story of how a single father with a hidden past saved the woman who would save him right back. Jack Miller had never imagined his life would lead him here, methodically mopping floors in the dead of night, while the city slept fitfully around him. At 36, his weathered hands told a story far different from the one most people assumed when they saw him in his gray custodial uniform. These weren't hands that had always known the weight of a mop handle or the burn of industrial cleaning chemicals. They had once designed intricate defense systems, written algorithms that could predict threat patterns with 98% accuracy, and signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But that was before Sarah's diagnosis, before the aggressive cancer that laughed at their savings account, before the endless medical bills that devoured everything they'd built together. That was before the funeral, where 8-year-old Emily had stood in her black dress, clutching a teddy bear and asking why Mommy wouldn't wake up, why God needed her more than they did. The transition from lead engineer at Prometheus Defense Systems to night janitor at Sterling Enterprises hadn't been gradual. It had been a deliberate choice, a conscious surrender to simplicity after complexity had taken everything from him. Emily needed stability now, needed routine, needed a father who came home every single morning to make her strawberry pancakes and walk her to school, not one who disappeared for weeks on classified projects he couldn't discuss. She didn't need to know that her father had once briefed 4-star generals, or that his security clearance had been so high that even mentioning certain projects required written permission from the Department of Defense. In their small 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, decorated with Emily's endless drawings of butterflies, rainbows, and surprisingly detailed robots, Jack had built a new life from the ashes of the old one. When she asked with innocent curiosity why Daddy cleaned buildings instead of building rockets like he used to, he would ruffle her brown curls and tell her that every job mattered, that there was honor in any honest work, that let him take care of her. The truth was infinitely more complex. The defense industry didn't forgive those who walked away, especially not those who knew its darkest secrets. Jack had burned every bridge with surgical precision to ensure no one would ever pressure him to return, to ensure his knowledge would die with him rather than be used for purposes that now haunted his dreams. Sterling Enterprises had hired him without asking too many questions, without running background checks that went too deep into his carefully reconstructed past. They needed someone reliable for the graveyard shift, someone who wouldn't steal, someone who would show up every night without complaint. They got more than they bargained for, though they'd never know it. Each night, Jack observed the corporate machinery from its margins, invisible to the executives who passed him without a glance, a ghost-haunting halls where billion-dollar deals were made with handshakes and lives were destroyed with emails. He had learned to find unexpected peace in the repetition, in the simple satisfaction of leaving things cleaner than he found them, in work where the only casualty was dirt. Olivia Sterling had felt the eyes on her for 3 weeks now. Maybe longer, if she was honest with herself about when the discomfort had started. It began subtly, a black sedan that appeared too often in her rearview mirror during her morning commute. Footsteps that matched hers on empty streets when she left the office at midnight. The unmistakable sensation of being photographed from across restaurants during business lunches. At first, she'd dismissed it as paranoia, the natural consequence of being 34, unmarried, and controlling a corporation worth more than some small country's entire GDP. But the signs multiplied like cancer cells, becoming impossible to ignore. Her private phone calls would develop strange echoes that hadn't been there before. Her apartment building's doorman casually mentioned visitors who asked about her schedule, men in expensive suits who claimed to be old friends but couldn't provide names. Once, she'd found her executive office disturbed in ways too subtle for security to notice, but too deliberate to be accidental papers shifted by mere centimeters. Her computer mouse not quite where she'd left it, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne lingering in the air. The worst part was having absolutely no one to trust with her fears. Her executive team was a carefully balanced ecosystem of ambitions and alliances, any of whom might profit from her downfall or vulnerability. Thomas Bradley, her executive vice president, watched her with barely concealed hunger for her position. The board members each had their own agendas, their own connections to competitors, who would pay handsomely for inside information. Her father, Richard Sterling, had built this empire on a foundation of suspicion and verification, teaching her from childhood that trust was a luxury leaders couldn't afford, that even family would betray you for the right price. Going to him would mean admitting weakness, proving she couldn't handle the pressure he'd warned her about when she'd fought for the CEO position at 30. The police would require evidence she didn't have, and hiring private security meant more strangers with unclear loyalties and potential conflicts of interest. So she endured in silence, maintaining her facade of absolute control during board meetings while checking her apartment for listening devices each night. She varied her routes home, changed her schedule randomly, learned to spot the same faces in different crowds. She'd even started carrying pepper spray in her Hermes bag, though she doubted it would help against professional surveillance. Tonight had been different though, more aggressive, more obvious. The man in the dark coat had been careless, or perhaps he wanted her to know he was there, wanted her to feel the fear. When she'd entered the building and saw Jack, the quiet janitor who kept his head down, who existed completely outside the corporate food chain, who had kind eyes that reminded her of her grandfather, something deep in her gut made her trust him. Maybe it was desperation, maybe intuition, maybe just the way he didn't look at her like she was an acquisition to be made, or a ladder to be climbed. He looked at her like she was human. The rooftop of Sterling Enterprises offered a completely different perspective on the city, one where the lights below looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet, and the wind carried away all pretense of corporate hierarchy. Jack had followed Olivia up the service elevator, his master custodial keys opening doors that most executives needed special clearance badges to access. She stood at the edge of the roof, not dangerously close, but close enough to make him instinctively nervous, her $5,000 designer suit incongruous against the industrial ventilation units and satellite dishes that cluttered the space. The city stretched endlessly below them, alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. "You must think I'm completely insane," she said without turning around, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Jack chose his words with the careful precision of someone who understood that whatever happened next would shatter the careful balance he'd built over 2 years. "I think you're terrified," he replied, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "And I think you have very good reason to be." She turned then, studying him with eyes that had negotiated billion-dollar mergers and hostile takeovers, but now seemed impossibly vulnerable, almost fragile. "I can't trust anyone in this building," she admitted, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "My father has spies throughout the company. The board members all have their own agendas, and someone wants me to fail badly enough to follow me home, to invade every aspect of my life." Jack listened without interrupting as she told him everything. The surveillance, the strange encounters, the growing certainty that someone was planning something terrible. She told him about the suffocating isolation of power, the crushing weight of expectations, the profound loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw dollar signs and opportunity when they looked at her. She'd never had real friends, only strategic alliances. Never had real relationships, only mergers that happened to involve dinner and calculated intimacy. When she finally finished, the city noise filled the silence between them like a living thing. "I'll help you," Jack said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority she hadn't expected. "But I have non-negotiable conditions. My daughter Emily doesn't get involved in any way. No one can know about this arrangement. And when you're safe, when this is over, we go back to being strangers. You're the CEO, and I'm the janitor. Nothing more." Olivia nodded quickly, relief flooding her features like sunrise after the longest night. "What made you decide to trust me?" she asked, genuine curiosity mixing with desperation in her voice. Jack looked out at the city lights, contemplating how much truth to share. "Because you're the first executive who's ever really seen me," he said finally. "Most people in suits look through janitors, like we're furniture, like we're part of the building itself. But you handed me that note like you knew I was a person who could help, like you saw something in me worth trusting." They stayed on the roof for another hour, planning in detail. Jack would shadow her after his shifts, use his universal access to monitor areas others couldn't reach, be the eyes in places where CEOs couldn't go without drawing attention. Neither acknowledged what else was happening, the unexpected connection forming between two damaged souls who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, the spark of something that had nothing to do with protection or surveillance. The parking garage at Sterling Enterprises was a concrete cavern, all harsh angles and flickering fluorescence that created dancing pools of shadow between the security camera's carefully mapped blind spots. Olivia's heels echoed like gunshots as she walked to her white Tesla, the sound bouncing off walls that suddenly seemed to press in from all sides. She sensed him before she saw him, the man from before, now moving with obvious purpose instead of subtle pretense. He emerged from behind a concrete pillar, like a nightmare made flesh, blocking her path to the car. His face partially obscured by shadow, but his intent crystal clear in his aggressive posture. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice professionally neutral in a way that made it infinitely more menacing than any threat. "Your father wants to talk to you. He's concerned about your recent decisions." Olivia's manicured hand moved instinctively to her phone, but he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell stale cigarette smoke, and something medicinal, almost chemical. "That won't be necessary," he said with practiced calm. "You're coming with me. We can do this voluntarily, or we can explore other options." Your father would prefer voluntary. The threat hung in the recycled air like exhaust fumes. Then Jack appeared, moving with a fluidity that belonged in special operations training videos, not in a janitor's repertoire. His approach was completely silent, until he wanted to be heard. Each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. "The lady's not interested in your offer," he said, positioning himself strategically between Olivia and the threat. The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor, pulling back his expensive coat to reveal a holstered Glock. "This isn't your business, janitor. Walk away while you can still walk. This is between family." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would replay in Olivia's mind for weeks like a slow-motion film. Jack's movement was economical, precise, a deflection that sent the man's hand away from his weapon, a strike to specific pressure points that dropped him to one knee gasping, a hold that had him desperately fighting for air without leaving any visible marks that would complicate legal proceedings. "You're going to leave now," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with absolute certainty. "You're going to tell whoever sent you that Miss Sterling is under protection. And if I see you again, if you come within 500 feet of her, we'll have a very different conversation, one that doesn't end with you walking away." He released the man, who scrambled away, his dignity abandoned in his desperate retreat. Jack turned to Olivia, his expression shifting from dangerous to concerned in an instant. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you before I arrived?" She shook her head, unable to speak, her mind struggling to reconcile the mild-mannered janitor she'd observed for months with this dangerous, capable protector. "Who are you really?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's shoulders sagged slightly, the adrenaline fading, leaving him looking older, more tired. "Someone who made a promise to keep you safe," he said simply. "Come on, I'll walk you to your car. Tomorrow, we need to have a serious conversation about your father and why he's having you followed." The coffee shop was deliberately ordinary, aggressively normal, the kind of place where executives never ventured, and surveillance would be immediately obvious among the college students and struggling artists who formed its regular clientele. Jack had arrived first, choosing a corner booth with clear sight lines to both entrances and the service exit, his back to the wall in a habit he'd never quite shaken. Olivia came in wearing carefully selected jeans and a Columbia University sweater, looking younger and somehow more real than she ever did in her corporate armor. She slid into the opposite seat, their knees almost touching under the small, scarred wooden table. "You are military," she said without preamble. It wasn't a question, but a statement of recognized truth. Jack stirred his black coffee slowly, considering how much truth she deserved, versus how much would keep them both safe. The spoon clinked against ceramic as he gathered his thoughts. "Not exactly," he said finally, meeting her eyes. "I was a systems engineer for defense contractors, the kind of projects that don't officially exist, that require forgetting you ever worked on them." He told her about his past. In carefully measured doses, the PhD from MIT completed at 25. The aggressive recruitment by companies whose names never appeared in newspapers. The work that had implications he only understood too late. After the systems were deployed, "I designed things that were supposed to protect people," he said, his voice heavy with a regret that had aged him beyond his years. But technology doesn't care about intention. In the wrong hands, protection becomes oppression. Defense becomes offense. A system designed to identify threats can just as easily identify dissidents. A network built to protect communications can become the ultimate surveillance tool. Olivia listened without interrupting, recognizing the weight of secrets in his words, the burden of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. "What made you leave?" she asked softly. Jack pulled out his phone, showing her a picture of Emily at her last birthday party. Gap-toothed grin, and chocolate cake covering most of her face. "My wife Sarah got sick 2 years ago. Aggressive pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't care how much money you throw at it or how many specialists you consult. I spent everything we had on treatments, sold everything that wasn't nailed down, liquidated our retirement, borrowed against life insurance. When she died, when I held Emily, as she cried for her mother, I realized she didn't need a father who built weapons, even defensive ones. She needed someone who would be there every single morning, who wouldn't disappear on classified projects, who could help with homework without worrying about security clearances, or whether discussing his day would violate federal law." He paused, meeting Olivia's eyes with uncomfortable honesty. "So, I disappeared. Changed our names legally but quietly. Took a job where no one would look for a former defense contractor with top-secret clearance. Started over in a place where I could be nobody, where Emily could have a normal life." Olivia reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand with unexpected tenderness. "You gave up everything," she said softly, understanding the magnitude of his sacrifice. "I gave up nothing that mattered more than her," Jack replied simply. The conversation shifted then, Olivia sharing her own story of sacrifice and expectation, of a father who loved her by controlling her, of a corporate throne she'd never wanted, but couldn't abandon without destroying thousands of jobs. They talked until the coffee shop closed around them, two people discovering that isolation came in many forms, but connection could bridge even the widest gaps. Richard Sterling's office occupied the entire 50th floor of Sterling Enterprises, a temple to corporate power with floor-to-ceiling windows that made visitors feel like they were standing in judgment before God himself. Every surface spoke of wealth and control: Italian marble, Japanese wood, German engineering. Olivia sat across from her father's massive mahogany desk, feeling like the child who'd once been summoned here for breaking curfew, despite now running the company that bore their name. Richard Sterling, 71 but looking younger through sheer force of will and the best surgeons money could buy, studied her with the calculating gaze that had built an empire from nothing. His hair was silver, perfectly styled, and his suit cost more than most people's cars. "The Takahashi Industries deal requires a stronger alliance," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been denied. "Marcus Chen is interested in you. His family's holdings in Asia would give us the leverage we need to dominate the Pacific market. The marriage would be the merger of the century." Olivia felt her stomach turn with revulsion and anger. Marcus Chen was 45, married twice before, with a reputation for treating women like acquisitions, to be optimized and discarded. "I'm not marrying for a business deal, Dad," she said, keeping her voice level through enormous effort. "This is the 21st century, not the Middle Ages." Richard's expression didn't change, carved from the same stone as the statues in his garden. "You're 34, unmarried, no children. The board questions your stability, your judgment. Some wonder if you're too emotional for this position, if giving you the CEO role was premature." He slid a leather folder across the desk with deliberate slowness. "These are reports from security. You've been seen with a janitor, multiple times, after hours. Do you understand what that looks like to our investors, to our partners?" The violation of privacy shouldn't have surprised her, but it still stung like a physical blow. "You've been having me followed," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question, but an accusation. "I've been protecting you," Richard corrected with paternal condescension. "From yourself. Apparently." This maintenance worker. This nobody, he's a distraction you can't afford. I've already spoken to HR about transferring him to our Detroit facility. He'll be gone by Monday unless you see reason. The threat was clear as crystal. Comply, or Jack would suffer. You can't just, she began, but Richard cut her off with a raised hand that had signed death warrants for entire companies. I built this empire from nothing, from one truck and a dream. I won't watch you destroy it for some misguided romantic notion, some rebellion against your responsibilities. The Chen merger will happen, with or without your cooperation, but it would be significantly cleaner with it. He stood, his 6-foot frame still imposing despite his age, the meeting clearly over. The board meets Thursday. I expect you to announce the engagement then. Wear the blue Dior, it photographs well. As Olivia left, she passed Thomas Bradley, the executive vice president, entering her father's office. Neither man bothered to lower their voices, assuming she was already in the elevator. But she heard Thomas say clearly, "The janitor situation is handled. The system breach will be traced to him by morning. No one will question it." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't just about marriage or mergers. This was about removing anyone who might support her independence, who might give her the strength to resist. Jack wasn't just at risk of transfer. He was about to be framed for something that could destroy his life and take Emily away from him forever. The accusation came at 6 in the morning, shattering the peaceful morning routine like a brick through glass. Security and police arrived at Jack's apartment just as he was making Emily's favorite breakfast strawberry pancakes with whipped cream smiley faces. The charges were serious: devastating corporate espionage, system sabotage that had allegedly cost millions in corrupted data, and compromised client information. Emily watched wide-eyed from the kitchen doorway as they searched their small home, her drawings scattered by indifferent hands looking for evidence that had been planted elsewhere in digital form. "Daddy?" she said, her small voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Are you in trouble? Did you do something bad?" Jack knelt beside her, keeping his voice calm despite the rage building inside him like a nuclear reactor approaching critical mass. "Everything's going to be okay, sweetheart. This is just a misunderstanding. Sometimes adults make mistakes about other adults." But the evidence was damning. Professionally crafted, his keycard had been used to access restricted servers at times when security footage conveniently malfunctioned. His login credentials were all over the breach, like fingerprints at a crime scene. Someone had done their homework, creating a digital trail that led inexorably to him with no obvious gaps or contradictions. The only thing that kept him from immediate arrest was Olivia's sudden intervention, arriving in casual clothes that didn't hide her authority, her presence commanding even in jeans. "He's not going anywhere," she told the police with steel in her voice, producing legal documents her personal lawyer had prepared in the pre-dawn hours. "Sterling Enterprises will handle this internally pending full investigation. We don't prosecute without absolute certainty." The police left reluctantly, clearly unhappy but unable to override corporate authority in a corporate crime. But the damage was done. The neighbors had seen, would talk, would whisper. Emily's school would hear. Parents would tell their children to stay away from the janitor's daughter. The careful, quiet life Jack had built was crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. After Olivia's security team left them alone, she found Jack sitting on Emily's bed, reading her favorite story as if it were any other morning. The little girl had finally fallen back asleep, exhausted by confusion and fear, her small hand clutching his shirt. "I'm sorry," Olivia whispered from the doorway, tears threatening to fall. "This is my fault. My father. He's going further than I ever imagined he would." But Jack shook his head, gently closing the book and joining her in the narrow hallway lined with Emily's artwork. "This isn't about fault," he said quietly, his mind already working through possibilities. "This is about power and control. Your father sees me as a threat to his plans for you. And he's right. I am." He moved to his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. But he made a critical mistake. They always do when they underestimate the janitor. Olivia watched, fascinated, as Jack accessed systems she didn't know existed, pulling up logs and data streams that looked like another language entirely. "I may have left defense work," he said, eyes never leaving the screen, "but I never forgot how to defend myself. Every keystroke, every access, every deleted file, it all leaves traces if you know where to look. If you understand the architecture." Within an hour, he had found it the real breach, initiated from Thomas Bradley's computer, but brilliantly disguised to frame him. The timestamp discrepancies were subtle but undeniable when you knew what to look for. "We need more than this," Jack said, his jaw tight with determination. "We need to prove the conspiracy, not just the technical details. Juries and boards don't understand code, but they understand betrayal." The next 3 days were a careful dance of deception and discovery. Olivia played the dutiful daughter to perfection, appearing to accept her father's arrangements, while secretly documenting every conversation with hidden recording devices Jack had provided. She attended meetings about the Chen merger, smiled at the right moments, even met with Marcus Chen for a lunch that made her skin crawl. Meanwhile, Jack continued his janitor shifts, but now his real work happened in the shadows between mopping and vacuuming. He installed monitoring software that would capture the conspirators' communications, recovered deleted files that showed the real timeline of the breach, built a case that would stand up in any court or boardroom. His skills, dormant for 2 years, came back with frightening efficiency. Emily stayed with Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who'd become like a grandmother to her, told only that Daddy had important work to do for nice Miss Olivia. The breakthrough came when Jack accessed the backup servers, the ones Thomas Bradley didn't know existed because they were part of an old system Jack himself had helped design years ago when Sterling Enterprises had briefly contracted with Prometheus Defense Systems. There it was, the original code, the real breach, time-stamped hours before Jack's credentials were supposedly used. But more importantly, there were emails, hundreds of them, Thomas to Richard, discussing the janitor problem and the need for a permanent solution. Richard's response, approving the frame job, but warning to keep Olivia ignorant until after the marriage was announced. The conspiracy laid bare in corporate speak that assumed their communications were private and protected. There were financial records too, showing Thomas had been promised a massive bonus and promotion once Olivia was neutralized through marriage, and Richard could resume shadow control. Jack shared everything with Olivia in another late-night rooftop meeting, the city lights bearing witness to their partnership. "This destroys them both," he said, showing her the evidence on a tablet. "Your father, Thomas, anyone else involved, they're looking at federal charges for corporate fraud, conspiracy, false accusations, potential RICO violations." Olivia stared at the screen, seeing her father's words. His betrayal not just of Jack, but of her, laid out in black and white clarity. "He's still my father," she said quietly, a tear finally escaping. Jack nodded with understanding. "And Emily's still my daughter. I understand complicated love, how it survives even betrayal." They stood together in silence, the city spreading below them like a circuit board, until Olivia spoke again. "The board meeting is tomorrow. If we're going to do this, it has to be then. Public, undeniable, with all the board members present. No chance for cover-ups or spin." She turned to him, and in the moonlight, he could see the tears she wouldn't let fall, the strength it took to stand against her own blood. "After tomorrow, everything changes. There's no going back." Jack reached out, taking her hand with infinite gentleness. "Everything already has changed," he said. "The moment you trusted me with that note, both our lives shifted course." They didn't talk about what existed between them beyond partnership, the connection that had grown from crisis but had become something deeper, something neither had expected or sought. Tomorrow would bring enough revelations. Tonight, they just stood together, two people preparing to risk everything for truth and each other. The boardroom at Sterling Enterprises was a monument to corporate power and intimidation. Brazilian rosewood, Italian leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, a table that could seat 30, but today held only 12 of the most powerful people in the business world. The board members filed in with the gravity of Supreme Court justices, each carrying the weight of billions in decisions. Richard Sterling sat at the head in his traditional position, supremely confident in his control, while Olivia took her place to his right, the dutiful daughter, apparently ready to announce her engagement to Marcus Chen, and secure the company's future. Thomas Bradley smirked from across the table, already calculating his increased power once Olivia was neutralized through marriage, his fingers drumming against the leather portfolio that contained his falsified evidence against Jack. "Before we begin the regular agenda," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of unquestioned power, "Olivia has an announcement regarding our expansion into Asian markets and the strategic alliance with the Chen family." Olivia stood slowly, smoothing her blue Dior dress, looking every inch the corporate princess her father had groomed since birth. "I do have an announcement," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But it's not about marriage or the Chen merger." The door opened with perfect timing, and Jack walked in. Not in his janitor's uniform, but in a charcoal suit that had been in storage for 3 years. Looking like the engineer and executive he'd once been. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing something in his bearing that didn't match their assumptions. Richard's face darkened dangerously. "Security," he began, his voice like thunder, but Olivia cut him off with raised hand. "Mr. Miller is here at my personal invitation," she said, her voice carrying a strength that made several board members sit up straighter. Sensing a shift in power dynamics, "He has information the board needs to hear regarding the recent system breach that cost us millions and nearly destroyed our reputation with key clients." Jack connected his laptop to the presentation system with smooth efficiency, his movements confident and professional. "Board members," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had once briefed Pentagon officials. "You've been told that I, a janitor with supposedly no technical knowledge, somehow breached your most secure systems. I'm here to show you the truth, and the truth is far more disturbing than a simple security breach." The evidence unfolded like a prosecutor's closing argument. Timestamps, emails, video footage from security cameras showing Thomas at his computer during the real breach, the coded messages between Richard and Thomas planning the frame. With each slide, the room grew increasingly tense. Board members exchanging alarmed glances. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Thomas said, standing abruptly, his face flushed. "You're going to believe a janitor over your executive team? This is obviously fabricated." But Jack clicked to the next slide, an audio recording of Thomas on a phone call, clearly discussing the plan to destroy evidence and frame Jack. The voice was unmistakable, the words damning. "The janitor's access codes are perfect. No one will question it. Just make sure the evidence is solid enough for arrest, but not so perfect it looks planted." The room erupted in controlled chaos. Board members demanded explanations. Richard stood, his composure finally cracking like ice in spring. "You don't understand," he said, looking at Olivia with something between rage and desperation. "Everything I did was to protect the company, to protect you from your own weakness, your emotional decisions. But Olivia was done being protected, done being controlled. No, Dad. Everything you did was to maintain your power even after you supposedly retired. You were so afraid of losing control that you were willing to destroy an innocent man's life, separate a father from his daughter." She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. "Jack Miller isn't just a janitor. He's a former defense contractor with a PhD from MIT, security clearance that most of us couldn't dream of achieving, and more integrity than anyone in this room. He took a custodial job to be there for his daughter after his wife died, and you tried to use that devotion against him." The board voted within the hour, the decision unanimous. Richard Sterling was removed as chairman, banned from company property. Thomas Bradley was terminated with cause, his assets frozen pending criminal investigation. A full federal investigation was launched. As the room cleared, board members murmuring about damage control and press releases, Emily appeared in the doorway, having been brought by Mrs. Chen after Jack's call that it was safe. She ran to her father, wrapping her small arms around his legs with fierce love. "Did you win, Daddy?" she asked, looking up with eyes that trusted him completely. Jack picked her up, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "We all won. Sweetheart." Olivia approached them, her corporate armor discarded, looking vulnerable but free for the first time in years. "What happens now?" she asked, her hand reaching out tentatively. 6 months later, Sterling Enterprises had a new head of security systems, Jack Miller, whose innovative approaches had already saved the company millions and prevented 3 breach attempts from competitors. His office was on the 40th floor, with a view of the city and pictures of Emily covering every surface. But the most significant change wasn't professional. Olivia had moved from her father's cold mansion to a warm brownstone in Brooklyn, one with a yard where Emily could play and rooms that felt like home instead of museum exhibits. The corporate princess and the janitor had become something neither had expected: a family built on trust, respect, and love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. Richard Sterling, facing federal investigation and social exile, had retreated to his estate in Connecticut, his empire intact but his influence shattered. He'd sent one letter to Olivia, not quite an apology but an acknowledgement that perhaps he'd been wrong about what strength looked like, what love meant. She kept it in a drawer, unopened but unforgotten, a reminder of how far she'd come. On Sunday mornings, Jack would make strawberry pancakes while Olivia helped Emily with her art projects, the 3 of them creating a life that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchies or defense contracts. They'd learned that sometimes the most profound connections came from the most unlikely circumstances, that trust could bloom in the shadows of suspicion, and that love didn't care about job titles or bank accounts. "Tell me again about how you and Daddy met," Emily would ask at bedtime, curled between them on the couch, safe and loved. Jack and Olivia would exchange glances, remembering that night of fear and desperation that had brought them together, that had changed everything. "She needed help," Jack would say simply, his arm around Olivia's shoulders. "And I was in the right place at the right time." But Olivia would add, squeezing Emily's hand gently, "He was the only one brave enough to see me as a person, not a position. And that made all the difference in the world." The story would grow and change with each telling, becoming family legend, but the truth at its heart remained constant. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one everyone else overlooks, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust someone who has nothing to gain from helping you, except the knowledge that it's right. The city lights would twinkle outside their windows, the same lights that had witnessed their first real conversation on a rooftop. But now, they didn't represent isolation or danger. Now they were just lights, beautiful in their own way, like the unexpected family that had formed in their glow. In the end, Jack hadn't just saved Olivia from those who wished her harm. They'd saved each other from lives of loneliness and loss, proving that redemption and love could come in the most unexpected forms. And in a bedroom decorated with butterflies and rainbows, a little girl slept peacefully, knowing that her father was no longer alone, that their small family had grown, and that sometimes the best stories were the ones that began with a note slipped between strangers in the middle of the night, a desperate plea for help that became the foundation of a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle.